Hello everyone, Jonathan Pan here, Technical Evangelist for Bixby. In today's tutorial video, I will be going over how to manage your session concepts as you develop a Bixby capsule. Be sure to follow me on Twitter at JohnWithoutTheH. Now these are the three questions we'll be answering during this video. First one is, what is a session? What does Bixby remember during a session? And how do I change what Bixby remembers? So the first question we need to answer is, what is a session? A session is when a user uses your capsule uninterrupted. I'm just going to demonstrate real quick with this simple video.
What would you like me to say? This is a session. Whose voice would you like me to change to?
This is a session.
And here you'll see that the bottom no longer says you are talking to CopyCat. You can see how that's going to be a new session now.
This is a new session.
So sessions end when you close Bixby. That one seems pretty obvious. When the timeout screen appears, or if you navigate away from your capsule in Bixby, just like how in the demo, you could see me click on the CopyCat logo, which took you to the marketplace. And finally, if you reach a result view without lock-in, in order to achieve lock-in, you need a conversation driver like this. So okay, in this video, we're going to be using the CopyCat capsule to demo session concepts. And CopyCat's a simple capsule, which during the demo video, you should be able to tell. All it does is it takes, what you want it to say and says it back to you. Now you can also change the voice as well. So these two concepts, the input, which is the text that the user says, and the voice, which is what voice, CopyCat will read you what you want it to say back to you with. These two concepts will be remembered and forgotten throughout the video. First, we need to understand the main action CopyCat. You can see here that it collects these reset booleans, which I will demonstrate later and explain later. And finally, you can see that it collects the input and the voice. So here you can see with this utterance, ask John to say, "I'm hungry." You'll see that John is the voice that gets fed into CopyCat. And you can see "I'm hungry" is what you wanted John to say. So that's the input. The next action that we're going to use is the check model. So this is in the same capsule, but this is for dev purposes only. And this is an action that collects the models and displays them to the user. You'll see this action in action soon enough. I'm going to give a quick demonstration. Ask John to say, "I'm hungry."
I'm hungry.
So this action right here, check models.
Here are all the models stored in Bixby's session state.
You can see the models that actually grabbed from Bixby's current session. You can see here we have the voice, John, that we just inputted. We have the input as "I'm hungry." And we have the output structure, which is what ends up being displayed to us, or what is outputted by the CopyCat action right here. You can see here, this output. So what happens if we run check models before we run CopyCat?
Here are all the models stored in Bixby's session state.
You can see how there's actually nothing stored in Bixby's session state. After
I'm hungry.
we give it a voice, and then we give it an input, and then we run check models.
Here are all the models stored in Bixby's session state.
You can see how now those concepts exist within Bixby. The default behavior is that Bixby remembers any concept like this, like text, like voice, any concepts that you have in memory, and it stores it during a session. So these concepts are only forgotten when a session ends. And let's go over the flow here real quick. Let's say a user asks your capsule, "Ask John to say I'm hungry." Then the action CopyCat will fire, and voice and input are then extracted from the utterance, and then they are sent to the Bixby cloud. They're being stored in Bixby session. Now these two concepts are then funneled into the action itself, CopyCat, and if there's any validations, it'll run it here. And then it'll pass those concepts to the JS file. The JS file will then output the output structure right here into the Bixby cloud, which then gets funneled back into the action CopyCat. The action will check for any errors, and if everything looks good, it will output this output, and then it'll display that to the user in the end. So what the check model thing does is, let's say the user fires the check models action with the utterance check models. The things in the Bixby cloud are actually grabbed and then sent to this action. So in other words, this is a completely separate action. It has access to the previous concepts from the CopyCat action. So this will run a validation if you have any, and it'll feed all this stuff into the checkmodels.js. And checkmodels.js outputs a structure called allModels, which then gets fed back into the action, checked for errors, and then fed back to the user. Okay, so now we know that Bixby always remembers these concepts by default. However, what happens if we add features transient? Right here you can see I added features transient to line 3. And now this concept, the input, will always be forgotten. So let's go ahead and do that in the code itself. We go to input. I'm just going to uncomment that right there. And I'm going to uncomment the voice right here. So by adding features transient to a concept, Bixby will always forget these concepts when it reaches the end of an action. And then you can see on line 3, input and voice are currently transient, so they will be forgotten once it reaches the end of CopyCat. However, output is not transient, and therefore output will actually be remembered. Let's go ahead and demonstrate what will happen now that we've added features transient. We're just going to still go with ask John to say I'm hungry.
I'm hungry.
Okay, cool. So what if we run the CopyCat action without any inputs?
What would you like me to say?
You can see how I forgot the input and how now it's asking you for the required input right here. So let's just say ASDF.
ASDF.
And there you go. So it actually forgets it every single
What would you
time
like me to say?
that we run CopyCat. And just to demonstrate, let's say we make voice and input both their default behavior. If we run
I'm
this
hungry.
and we run CopyCat, you'll notice how it remembers.
I'm hungry.
And it won't re-prompt you for an input. But if we mark input as transient, it'll remember the voice because this is still default, and it'll forget the input every time. So let's go ahead and demo that.
I'm hungry.
You see here it says I'm hungry, but if I click CopyCat, what should it do? It should ask me for an input.
What would you like John to say?
But notice here how it still remembers the voice.
Asked.
And you can see how it still remembers John's voice right there, which is the default. And just to summarize from the information flow perspective, now we have input and voice marked as transient. Here's what happens. The action CopyCat still gets fired and the voice and input are extrapolated. They're sent to the Bixby cloud, which are then sent to the action CopyCat. Now, it runs the validation, feeds it back into copycat.js, and then it sends the output to the Bixby cloud. The output gets sent to the action CopyCat, which then checks for errors, outputs it, and then outputs it to the user. But then, at the very end, voice and input are forgotten. So now the check models action can't actually fetch these two, but it'll be able to fetch the output. So let's do that in the actual capsule itself.
I'm hungry.
And let's click on check models.
Here are all the models stored in Bixby's session state.
You can see how the voice and the input are undefined because now they are transient. And you can see how the output is defined. So if we actually add features transient to the output,
I'm hungry.
and then we check the models,
Here are all the models stored in Bixby's session state.
you'll see how all three are now undefined. So adding features transient will have these concepts forgotten at the end of that action. And just to illustrate that real quick with the check models action in this scenario, we have only the output being fed to action check models, runs a validation, sends it to the JS file, which outputs an all models object. The all models is given to the action check models, which checks for errors, outputs an all models, and then outputs that to the user. But the main thing here is that both the voice and the input are no longer being fed into the check model's action. This leads to kind of a binary problem. We have the scenario where Bixby never forgets during a session, which is the default behavior. And we have the situation where Bixby always forgets with transient. So this kind of puts us in a situation where we can either forget it or not forget. However, fortunately, there's a way where we can make Bixby forget when we wanted to. And we do that with flags. So in this example here, we have start over as the NL utterance. And here you can see that we've actually set a value on reset to be true. So now with the flag set up, let's say we go through this flow again with CopyCat ask John to say I'm hungry. Nothing here is really going to change. Those get fed into the action CopyCat, which runs a validation, gets sent to the copycat.js, which makes an output. Output gets sent to the action CopyCat, which checks it for errors, gives you an output, which then sends it to the user. But now let's say the user says start over. The start over sets the flag reset to true. Now this reset gets sent to the Bixby cloud along with the voice and the input, which are already there. And these three all get fed into action.copycat. So now it runs validations on voice and input. So now it runs validations if it has any, and I'll give a quick demonstration of those later. And then it feeds all three of these input, reset, and voice into copycat.js. But in the JS file, we have a library called fail. And what we can do with it is we can check to see if the reset boolean is true. And if it is true, then we throw an error called reset. So since reset is true, you can throw this JavaScript error out. And now this error will be sent to action copycat. So copycat checks it for errors, and then it notices the error. And right here at the output level, you can see how it can catch this error called reset. So what it does here is that it's actually recalling copycat and starting this all over. However, one trick with this is that when you replan with this intent here, if you don't explicitly pass in any values, it'll actually run copycat without the voice and the input. So I like to call this the error catch and replan. This dialog here, the reset all debug message, now it's mainly for obviously debugging whether or not that this part actually fired, or you can inform a user that an error has occurred even though you're recalling the action. But here, the most important thing is that no inputs are passed in. So let's do a quick demonstration of this. And first thing, we have to actually make everything not transient anymore. And then let's run our
I'm hungry
thing. And here you can see check models is
Here are all the models stored in Bixby's session state.
So these models are still here, and if we run copycat, John will still say I'm hungry.
I'm hungry.
Okay, but now let's say we do start over.
Reset all debug message. What would you like me to say?
Now the reset all debug message has fired. Here you can see that it's been caught right here, and this message has been shown. And along with the fact that copycat has been called, but it did not grab the earlier input, I'm hungry. So now we can actually provide it a new input.
I forgot I was hungry.
And it also forgot John's voice. So now it's reading it back in our default setting voice. So if we look at this, we can see that we can actually do a reset boolean for each of the things. Let's say we just want to reset the input, we just want to reset the voice, or we just want to reset everything. You can have these trainings specifically to set those booleans to true. Let me also just show you that training. So right here in our start over training, all you have to do is click on this little sidebar right here, and then you can type in reset and true for the boolean. So that's how you do it, in case you were wondering. So now this is where the validate comes in. You can see here that if input does not exist, we actually want to change our reset variable to false because we have nothing to actually reset in this case. Because you can't just have a voice without an input since voice is optional. So this is a bit of thinking and familiarity with this capsule, but that's what this validate is for. And here for the reset input, we need the same clause here. If input doesn't exist, we don't want it to, go through, ask the user for an input, and then throw an error that says you still need to reset the input. Since voice is optional, you're never prompted for the voice during the copycat action, hence why we don't need to validate reset voice. So speaking of validate, you can use validate to validate the inputs. And what's interesting about validate is that in the validate, let's say you do a replan, whatever the goal is, whether it's an action or it's a concept, it has to return the same thing, the same type of concept as the thing that it's validating. So in the case of validating the reset, the replan must return the reset concept. And here you can see how it's returning the reset concept, but as false. We pass that value in the reset to set it to false. And right here, you can see how this resets the input as false. That summarizes session concept management in Bixby. I hope you've learned the nuances of the default behavior in comparison to transient, as well as perhaps utilizing flags to force Bixby to forget certain concepts. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and follow me at Twitter at John without the H. Thank you again.